This is Evangelist George McTyre of the Word of God Ministry, and I'm here today to make a statement about the aftermath of the George Zimmerman acquittal in the death of 17-year-old unarmed youth Trayvon Martin. I'm recording this on July the 21st, 2013. Now, what I have to say, a lot of you are probably going to be a little upset about it. So I would like to say this. Let us agree to disagree, but I would like for you to at least hear me out uh, completely before you make the determination of whether you think I've lost my mind or I'm not black enough or whatever. So let me present the case. All right. This past week, there has been ongoing outrage and protests over the acquittal of George Zimmerman of the shooting death of unarmed 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. The problem is in the black community, most claim that the killing was the result of racial profiling, meaning the only reason Zimmerman followed Trayvon in the first place was because he was black. There is also the claim that Zimmerman started the problem by first getting out of his vehicle to follow him. Then there is also the claim that Zimmerman started the altercation which led him to shoot Trayvon Martin. Then we have the fact that the community where this incident took place is predominantly white. Without going into all the details, which I probably should, for the simple fact that depending on who you get most of your information from, the details are sketchy at best. However, most of the outrage centers on just what was it that the jury did or did not see in the trial that caused them to unanimously return an acquittal or a not guilty verdict. Some of you, as I said earlier, may not agree with what I saw as the reason for this verdict. So let's agree to disagree. The trial was essentially to determine whether or not George Zimmerman committed second degree murder. Second degree murder is essentially any deliberate action that is taken to do great bodily harm to a person that may result in their death, though it was not the assailant's intent. As in the case of any trial, the accused is assumed to be innocent until proven guilty. In other words, the state bears the sole responsibility of presenting proof of its accusation with evidence. The accused does not have to prove anything. Well, at first, this was the only charge against him. It was either that or a not guilty verdict. However, as the trial progressed, and witnesses were called to prove the state's case, it became clear that there was no way they could prove second degree murder. Just as a side note here, back when all of this action took place, I mean, back when all of this furor about the Trayvon, about George Zimmerman walking free when Trayvon Martin had been killed back last year in 2012, I said from the get-go, as soon as they had mentioned the fact that they were going to charge him with second degree murder, I said there's no way in the world they can prove that, not given the circumstances as we know that they are today, or as with the evidence that was presented by the state and the witness and so forth like that. I said there was no way in the world that they were going to do that. However, anyway, uh, so when it became clear that the state was not going to get a guilty verdict on that charge, they opted to give the jury a second lesser choice of manslaughter. Now, manslaughter falls into two categories: voluntary and involuntary. Voluntary is when a person deliberately takes an action, usually reckless, that causes a person's death. A very good example of this is driving drunk. Involuntary is when you do something that normally wouldn't cause a person's death, but does. Example, you are in a fist fight with someone and you knock them down, and while falling, they hit their head against something and end up dying. That is involuntary manslaughter. The reason why I'm taking the time to explain this is because, as a former police officer in the Air Force, I have a more in-depth knowledge of these things. Anyway, the state knew it couldn't prove the first charge, so they threw this one in. Yet, the burden of the state was to offer evidence to prove it. Well, for the state to prove voluntary manslaughter, they would have to once again prove Zimmerman intended to injure Trayvon without meaning to kill him. To prove involuntary, they would have to prove Zimmerman did something reckless that led to Trayvon's death. The problem is, no one could offer any evidence to prove any of these charges. Everything the prosecution presented was essentially speculative, meaning it could be this way or it could be that way. Talking about the fact that since Zimmerman pleaded self-defense, so it could either be manslaughter or it could be self-defense. That, ladies and gentlemen, opens up the area of doubt. Let us not forget the eyewitness that saw Trayvon on top of Zimmerman beating him. All the photo evidence showed that the injuries Zimmerman had were consistent with his account of what happened. The state failed to prove its case, and since the jury had reasonable doubt, they had to vote not guilty. But that hasn't set well with most of the black community. What they see is another example of racial bias because of a nearly all white jury. There was one Hispanic on it, saying Trayvon's life was somehow cheapened. Well, here are a few facts that most blacks don't know or conveniently overlook. First and foremost, though he appears white, Zimmerman is Hispanic, a person of color, just like we are. People have been saying if Zimmerman had been black and Trayvon was white, would the outcome have been the same? Well, thank God we don't or shouldn't listen to speculation. But in this case, and hopefully all cases, people will look at and weigh all the evidence and make a righteous decision. In this case, they did. One thing that disturbs me is the actions of many, if not most, black preachers that are dissatisfied with this verdict and are leading protests all over the nation. By them doing this, being Christians, they are making it appear that Christ supports what they are doing. Let me tell you what Jesus said about situations like this. In St. John chapter number 7 and verse number 24, Jesus says, "Judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment." Let me read that again. Judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. What he is telling Christians is that we, not the ungodly, need to operate on a higher plane than they. The ungodly look at a situation, make a determination, and act accordingly without one shred of proof. It is something that they saw or heard about. The Christian is to go a lot further than that. We are to look at all the evidence before we make a judgment and then apply godly wisdom to that decision. Failure to do that makes us no better than the ungodly, and not to mention destroying the image of Christ. These preachers need to take heed to that fact. They also need to be educated in how the court system works. The other day, Jesse Jackson, one of our august leaders, I am speaking generically, though I don't follow any man. Christ is my leader. Anyway, Jesse Jackson complained in an interview that the jury was not made up of, now get this, Trayvon's peers. In other words, I take it he believes that the jury was supposed to be made up of Trayvon Martin's peers. Anyone with half a brain knows that juries are supposed to be made up of the defendant's peers, which this one was. I posted on YouTube uh, a little video clip that shows Jesse Jackson actually saying this. So you can go on YouTube and check it out. All you have to do is go on YouTube and type in the search engine on YouTube Jesse Jackson, and then uh, my initials G space E space McTyre. Then hit enter, and the the identifying link should show up for you to look at it for yourself. We have the Reverend Al Sharpton running all over the place talking about justice for Trayvon, as if the jury, by being made up of whites and an Hispanic, after looking at all the evidence, denied him, Trayvon, justice. Meaning they should have found Zimmerman guilty for no other reason than he appears white. These are preachers, people, and they are highly regarded in our community. If they were just ordinary black leaders, then I wouldn't have all that much to say. But the fact that they carry the title Reverend, they are making all Christians look bad, and I'm not going to stand for it. Because, as I mentioned earlier, they are making Christ look bad. If they want to do all of this for Trayvon, why didn't they do the same thing for 9-month-old Delrick Miller, Delric Miller, that was killed in a drive-by shooting, or 12-year-old Khadijah Davis, who 1 month later was shot and killed not by a white perpetrator but by a black numbskull arguing with a parent of hers over a cell phone. Jesse and Al, nowhere in sight. This is just one case in more than 1,000 blacks that get killed every year by other blacks. And you know what the tragedy of it all is? They are forgotten because Jesse and Al can't get any TV time when it's a black on black shooting. And these victims had the misfortune of being killed by another black. To them, Jesse and Al, it's not going to get them any accolades. Jesus said something about this idea of trying to make whites respect us. Matthew chapter 7, starting at verse number 3 says, "And why beholdest thou the mote in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how will you say to thy brother, Let me pull out the mote from thine eye, and behold, a beam is in your own eye? Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye." It means before you go out trying to tell others how they should act towards you, you better make sure you have your house or community straight and blameless first. It also means, and I want to emphasize this, is then thou see clearly. It also means that when we go around angry, we can't see or think clearly. And what are we angry about? The way we are treated by those we hate and don't trust. When we have over 1,000 victims of black on black shootings a month, and maybe 100 cases of shootings of blacks by someone outside of our race per year, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see where our focus should be. If we want whites to respect us, then we need to first respect ourselves. As long as these preachers are going around stirring up protests because of their ignorance, then we need to just shut up before our actions land us in more disfavor, not only with man, but God. Think about this for a moment. Jesse and Al are encouraging the most wicked among us to act on this with violence. And if they do, some of them will get killed, as well as some innocent whites or blacks that might be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their blood will be on Jesse and Al's hands, as it will be on any preachers that back this foolishness. As Christians, we are or should be aware of the fact that if God looked at us the way we look at this situation, we would be busting hell wide open. Because there's none of us that's walking around here that doesn't have some sin or something in their lives that God hates. And if he did to us what we're trying to do to whites that do something to us and carry anger and all that resentment and stuff like that, if God did us like that, we would bust hell wide open. Not only that, but take a listen to this. Gospel of Mark, chapter 11, starting at verse number 25. And when you stand praying, forgive if you have aught against any, that your Father also which is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses. Verse number 26. But if you do not forgive, neither will your Father which is in heaven forgive your trespasses. You keep on carrying anger in your hearts, God will not hear or forgive you of your trespasses against him. And that means your blessings will be cut off. You all need to think as to just who you are following and why. This is Evangelist George McTyre, the Word of God Ministry. That's the conclusion of my thoughts on this issue. Might I say, we may not agree, so let's agree to disagree. And may God bless you and your families real good.